inside the White House Office of Telecommunications Policy. It doesn't exist anymore. We remained close friends in all those years. But if Tony hadn't told me about that, she had worked for Dominic in the past and then worked with Cap Weinberger and knew Tom Whitehead, I would have never known about that job. I would have never had it. And that job, as you'll see in just a moment, turned out to be incredibly important to my future. Because among all the things about me that you should know is I'm an extreme generalist. I have no big degrees. I have a PhD. I have a Bachelor of Arts from Purdue University in speech. And so here I am in Washington. I've been in the Navy. I'm now into this process of getting to know what the town's like. I'm now about 28 years old, 29 years old, and because of Tony, who I haven't seen for 30 years, introducing me to Tom Whitehead, that's his nickname, Tom, I went to work there and got one of the greatest educations anybody could ever hope to have for somebody who's a generalist about communications policy, satellites, cable television, public television, broadcast television, and all that. And then, after I worked for him and got out of there, I was out and I had my first job, and this was after working in the Nixon White House, which the tension and the strain is very similar to what we have today, or worse. Frankly, it was worse because of the Vietnam War and Watergate. And so the 3.5 years there were very complicated because of the things you could not get done. However, we got a lot done because they weren't paying attention. And we were in this weird position of being of the White House but not in the White House. And even though we were attached to the White House, a lot of them down there didn't care much for us and didn't even understand what we were doing because they were totally political. And every time we wanted to do something, they'd ask the question, does this help us politically? And we didn't care. That wasn't what we were doing. We wanted to change communication policy. And remember, though, at that time, you still had just 20 channels at most with cable in some communities, but not very many. And this is basically what most Americans had, were 3 choices. And there I was. I was in New Orleans for a convention right after I got out of the White House operation, and at the National Cable Television Association, and I'm sitting at a lunch there, and this woman right here, Barbara Ruger, is sitting next to me. I strike up a conversation with her. She runs a little magazine that wasn't very impressive called CATV Weekly. She was impressive, but the magazine wasn't. And a couple weeks later, I went to Denver where they were located to visit a friend of mine, and I called her up and said, I'd love to come over and see your operation. When I arrived over there to her, at the time I was just doing a little newsletter. I was making $500 a month, period. At that point, this would be 1974, 75. I was about 33 years old or so. And when I arrived at her office, she said, how would you like to be our Western Bureau Chief? She said, I heard what you said to me down in New Orleans when we were sitting together, that you wanted to start this network thing. And I didn't have a name for it. I just wanted to change television in my own little head. I didn't have any money, and no connections. And I just, because you were, in those days, like Adam Powell today from USC is dreaming about all this new technology and they're working with it. We were dreaming in those days of getting more magazines and getting more choice. And it was a fever. I mean, you wanted to get away from the domination of 3 networks in New York City on 6th Avenue that basically all did the same kind of work. You didn't have very many documentaries, which is my first love. You didn't have very many voices at all. You had just those voices, and they were fine. They're professionals. They did a great job in their world, but we needed more voices. And so anyway, she said, how would you like to be our Western Bureau Chief? We'll pay you $1,000 a month. You can write a column every week, and we'll put your picture in it, and that will introduce you to the cable television industry. I didn't think for that very long. I mean, the magazine wasn't much. Some weeks they only had 8 pages, but it went to everybody in the cable television business. And I said, yes, I'll take that job, and I did. And I went to work for CATV Weekly. I'm not much of a writer. I can write, but that's not my first love. I ended up getting a tape recorder, and I got a camera, and a lot of energy, and went around and found every week a person interviewed. I took their picture. We put them on the cover of the magazine. It was a Q&A situation, just question and answer, and then I wrote a column. And my columns were about what I thought were important at the time. And I'd been in the government, and I kind of understood that a little bit at that point. And so I was trying to drill down in the process to get to where this cable television industry, I'd be a part of it, would open up the whole process, and we'd have a lot more channels. And If Barbara hadn't suggested that, I would have never thought about working for that magazine, because it was not, as Ted Herner is sitting in the back of the room and is a trade press writer today where the magazines are much better, it was not very much of a publication. I went there, I worked there for 8 months. And I told these fellows that I was working for, I said, I'm really interested in trying to create a new network. And they kind of looked at you in those days like you were smoking something. And they give you that, you know, what do you think you could possibly do? I mean, I had nothing. I had no money. I didn't know anybody. And so during that 8-month period, I couldn't live any longer. I was making $500 in the newsletter and $1,000 writing for the magazine. That's $1,500 a month. And I was paying all my expenses. And so I had to at some point, if this dream I had was going to move forward, I had to figure out a way to make more money and to have somebody that was helping me out in the process. After 8 months, they called me in one day and they said, we decided that we can't do this any longer because we're not about to be able to pay you any more money. And then it was a nice way of saying, you're out of here. And it's the best thing that ever happened. Because there was a fellow by the name of Bob Tisch who had started a magazine called Cablevision on his own. He'd worked at CATV Weekly and all that. He'd started this new magazine, and it was pretty fancy in the beginning. And he said, called me up like in 2 or 3 days. He heard out with me. He said, I will hire you. I will pay you $42,000 a year. I will do what I can to help you start the network. What do you think? And you can become our Washington Bureau Chief. Well, I thought I'd died going to heaven. And I should tell you, Bob Tisch is still very much alive today, never went to college. And he sold his company a couple years ago for a lot of money. And there's a very interesting story about Bob Tisch that, you know, I can go into later if you're ever interested, but he's a tremendous character. He lived up to every promise that he made. That was how it all kind of started in the mid-70s. And at that point, with this kind of a background, I want to take you back on the regulation front to 1969. Regulation, as some of you in this room probably have discovered by now, can be incredibly boring. The details can be boring, but that's why you spend all this time with this education, so you can go out and fool everybody eventually in those law offices and around town and get legislation passed and regulations passed. But in 1969, go back to my friend Tom Whitehead, who was heading up the Office of Telecommunications Policy when I went to work there. He was in the White House. He was in the transition of the Nixon administration. He was responsible for, among other things, for communications. And he was 31 years old. And this is always interesting in this town when you're that age, because a lot of people resent it who've been around here for a long time. But the chairman of the Federal Communications at that time was a man named Roswell Hyde. And Roswell was quite a bit older, probably twice his age at a minimum. And Roswell Hyde came to visit Tom one day in the White House and said, I have a policy here that I want you to endorse on satellites. In 1962, they passed the ComSat Act, Intelsat. They launched international satellites that could only be used from here to London and here to Japan, but not from here to Chicago in 1964. And so a lot of people who weren't in the business wanted the domestic satellite. They knew it was going to cut the cost of transmitting from point A to point B in this country. Because just to give you an idea, in those days, if I needed time to get to all the cable systems in the United States, it would have cost me, we figure at that time, now this is many years later, about $15 million for me to have a transmission system that I would buy from AT&T, and that was about your only choice, to get to all these cable systems. When the satellite was launched in 1974 and 75, and I ended up being involved in purchasing time for the beginning of C-SPAN, my time cost $100 an hour. And we weren't even televising a full day. It was 8 hours a day. But just look at the difference between $100 and $15 million. Now, if you're owning this is a television network, and this is a television network, and this is a television network, and you have a little company over here called AT&T, and you control everything, including the manufacturing of the telephones. You had lots of choices, black or white telephones in those days, and you couldn't buy them. You could only rent them. And some people to this day are still paying a rental fee every month. They don't know it. Not many, but some are. But if you can imagine, these people aren't the slightest bit interested, even though they're talking about the First Amendment, they're talking about the need for freedom of speech and all that. They don't want about 4,973 more magazines sitting over here on the same stand. They love this. This is a monopoly, or an oligopoly, and they love it. And that's human nature. This is not criticism. This is normal for people to feel that way. So when Roswell Heights said to Tom Whitehead, 31-year-old guy talking to a guy twice his age, we want to launch a domestic satellite system, and we want to make it single entity. We want to get everybody together in one little company, ABC, NBC, CBS, Hughes, RCA, AT&T, all together, and we'll form a board and all that stuff, the same thing we did with ComSat, and we'll have one company launching the satellites, and we'll get on with it. Tom at that age says, Roswell Heights leaves. He says, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. This country is a competitive country, a competitive environment, and the marketplace decides and all that stuff, and he, single-handedly, with all the people that he worked with and everything, put together a policy called Open Skies. Without Open Skies, we wouldn't have been a network. Open Skies, originally, it was proposed by the White House to the chairman of the FCC, Dean Birch, and at that point, they were Birch took over the FCC after Roswell Heights left, and they adopted the Open Skies policy, which meant that there was competition in the skies. There was Western Union put up the first domestic satellite in April of 1974. RCA put up a satellite, began operating in 75. Hughes Corporation, GTE, the phone company, put one up. There were 6 in the beginning, I believe, 6 competitors up there, which meant there was competition. 6 is a pretty good number, which meant that they had schemes where I could buy $100 an hour. But if young Tom Whitehead hadn't come along and said, at the point where Roswell Heights was a Republican and should have been a marketplace guy at the time, of course, you can see how labels get turned upside down in this town all the time. If Tom hadn't been there, nobody else was paying attention to the White House. Presidents do not pay attention to communication. I've never seen a president yet that pays attention to communication. Their people do, and their staff does, but this is all, they just got more important things to worry about. And it has so much power in this country, so much value, all these new voices. So Open Skies happened, and Tom Whitehead, who teaches at George Mason, he's in retirement right now, but he's here, and he's a tremendous guy and a great guy for you to know, and Tom knows him very well and brings him into his class from time to time. At the same time, by the way, the Federal Communications, this is one of the more fascinating things that happened in those days. If you had a cable television system, the FCC mandated that you had to have a 9 or 10 meter dish, 33 feet wide, $80,000, passive. You had to be licensed. They demanded that that's, if you had 1,500 customers and you were down here in Culpeper, you had to have an $80,000 dish to bring it in. Think about what it cost today. They give them away today. The little tiny dishes, they give them away. In those days, they demanded that you buy, the FCC did. And Steve Afros, who teaches at George Mason today, a tremendous guy, probably knows more about cable television than anybody alive, and all the regulation and all that. He was in this little organization called Community Antenna Television Association, the little guys, not the big corporate guys, the little guys. And Steve fought to get these dishes reduced in size down to about 4.5 meter dishes, and instead of costing $80,000, costing about $15,000 or less. Now the attitude on the part of the FCC often, and Tom was down there for a couple of years as an economist, and some of you may even work there, the attitude often is, we can't let anybody fail. That's why they were afraid to have a competitive world up there when it came to these satellites. We can't let anybody fail in this business. That's why they were very happy that they had 3 networks. They were doing very well, thank you.